After the 7 Years' War, Britain wanted to tax the 13 colonies more to pay their war debt from the 7 Years' War. So, they introduced the Sugar Tax and Stamp Act and also the Townshend Act. The Sugar Act forced the colonies to import sugar from England and pay duties, and the colonies were basically given nothing, as they called it, taxation without representation. As time went on, this pissed off everyone in the 13 colonies and they began to get a bit pissed. So the colonists, specifically people living in Boston, began to boycott the British goods and make their own stuff. This pissed the British off massively, so they began sending troops to Boston in order to bring order to the city. The colonists got angry and began throwing snowballs, and then that turned into rocks and oyster shells, and then the British decided to open fire on the colonists, causing what we now know today as the Boston Massacre. This pissed off the colonists, and so the Founding Fathers came from across the colonies to the First Continental Congress, and they discussed the issues with the British in great detail. And they eventually decided to ask the king to stop, which, he said no, so they went back and decided to ask the poorly trained local militiamen to be ready at a minute's notice, because they were very, very pissed. Eventually, the British went to rebel-controlled Concord and decided to meet the colonists. A local named Paul Revere the road on his horse to warn that the British were coming. Eventually, the two sides met in Lexington, and one of the colonists shot what was the shot heard around the world, which was the shot from the musket that began the Revolutionary War. Eventually, the British were forced to flee back to Lexington as they were outnumbered by the rebels, these rebels being poorly trained militiamen against one of the greatest armies in the world at the time. The rebels then circled Boston and held the city under siege. Eventually, the news reached the king, who was very, very angry, to put it mildly. The Founding Fathers then agreed to put together a proper army and enlisted the help of Commander-in-Chief George Washington as their Commander-in-Chief. Eventually, a proper army was formed, and they decided to break the siege by attempting to take the Boston at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Americans fought ferociously and did not take the city, but really did deal some serious damage to the British army. They were not considering declaring independence, though, as that was seen as a very distant idea at the time. Eventually, they decided to send a letter to the king asking for the taxes to be levied and we could end the conflict, to which he said no because he was not going to listen to a bunch of these puny militiamen. So the British then began to burn down some towns as revenge. The colonial army tried to also take Montreal but failed. George Washington needed some artillery really badly, so eventually they brought it to him, and they decided to set the artillery up around the British-controlled Boston, and the British knew that at that point they were toast, literally and figuratively. So instead of another bloody conflict, the British just decided to withdraw from Boston, and the city of Boston was eventually given up to the colonists. This was the first major victory of the war. Eventually, the idea of independence came about when Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, to which was very popular and encouraged the Founding Fathers, specifically Thomas Jefferson, to write the Declaration of Independence. This was the moment the United States of America was born. After some preparations and waiting around, the British eventually sent more men to New York to battle the rebels and take back command. So they dug in at Staten Island and the revolutionary forces waited at Brooklyn Heights. But the British never actually attacked and decided to wait around to test the resolve of the American forces. The British tried to play lots of mind games, but the colonists were very resistant. And then the British eventually landed on the Brooklyn Heights and battled with the Americans. The Americans then realized they were only fighting with a decoy British force, and the main force eventually outnumbered them and caused them to flee. They fled all the way to Pennsylvania, and the British took most of New Jersey, my home state. At this point, most of the fighting in the rest of the Revolutionary War took place in my home state of New Jersey. The revolution was at its lowest point and needed a quick plan to get back on their feet. So they decided to plan an attack for the winter because nobody actually expected them to attack in the winter. Eventually the British defenses were down and Washington launched his next attack. He made the famous Delaware crossing on an icy river on a small boat, and then marched to Trenton, and after a fierce battle, managed to take the city. After taking some more cities near Trenton, the British left southern New Jersey alone for the winter. Eventually, the Founding Fathers sent Ben Franklin to France to convince King Louis to help them fight the British, because the French also hated the British. This ended up screwing over the French later, however that'll be a different video entirely, as that caused the French Revolution. After some negotiating, King Louis eventually agreed. Both British armies tried to flank the Americans from Canada and New York, but luckily the Americans held them off. The British then went to take the then capital of the colonies, Philadelphia, and beat the rebels and take their capital city. Congress then made York their temporary capital. Eventually, the Captain Horatio managed to knock the British back to Canada again, but did defy the Founding Fathers' orders, and he did it all on his own. Eventually, a Prussian guy hired by Ben Franklin gave the rebels a proper military training, and they were then off to the races and were out of Philadelphia and moved their forces back to New York. However, the Americans recruited the help of the Spanish, which also hated the British just as much as the French did. Eventually, the British began to run out of money and supplies. The British Parliament was very angry about the war, as it was costly and wasting resources. So the British decided to fix their strategy and decided to invade the South instead, and took major cities like Savannah and Charleston under siege. Eventually, Horatio, the guy from earlier, decided to invade the southern colonies to rival George Washington, but failed spectacularly, so George Washington decided to get Nathaniel Greene to go down to the South instead. He went down to the South and had the British chase after him, but then got more men along the way and absolutely destroyed the British fleet. Eventually, the French troops arrived and they were ready to fight. The British then decided to abandon the Carolinas and mobilizing Yorktown. Eventually, the Continental Army and the French sent a decoy force to make it look like they were going to invade New York, but they decided to send their real force to Yorktown to battle the British. After a month of holding Yorktown under siege, the British gave up and fled the city. Eventually, the war was getting too costly for the British, and they were looking less likely to win day by day, so the Founding Fathers and the King made a deal with the Treaty of Paris, in Paris, which made the British remove their troops from England and recognize U.S. independence, and in return, America paid it back its debts to England. After a bloody revolution, a beautiful cornerstone of freedom and democracy eventually came about.